It is truly a condition that brings families to their knees. And because it's a condition that's only been around officially for 3 years, it's something that's not very common, like known by healthcare professionals. And so families end up really feeling alone in this and don't have the support that they need to be able to identify it, treat it, and find the right resources and support.
Hello, and welcome to That's Good Parenting, the podcast that provides simple steps to help reduce your parenting stress. I'm your host, Dory Durbin. And as a children's book coach, author, illustrator, podcaster, fellow parent, I am on a mission to help you find ways to make your parenting more enjoyable. Here's the thing, though. Have you ever been concerned as a parent when you're watching your child eat? And maybe it's because they don't want to eat what you're offering, or maybe they're afraid of eating in general. Maybe those concerning issues are things that you haven't been able to actually utter. Here's the thing. There is something called Pediatric Feeding Disorder, or PFD, that affects countless families, causing stress, frustration, and worry about their child's health and development. So today, we get to sit down with Jaclyn Pederson. She's from Feeding Matters, and she's going to help us unpack all of these questions that are in our minds. Jaclyn is the CEO of Feeding Matters and has over a decade of experience in program development and deep commitment to making the world for children with PDF just that much better. So welcome, Jaclyn.
Thank you so much for having me, Dory. Really excited to be here and to talk all things feeding.
We talked about this before we started, and you asked me just point blank, have you ever heard of this before?
Yeah.
And I said, no, I have not. And so I think for our audience's sake, we need to maybe delve into that a little bit and what the misconceptions are behind it, if you can.
Sure. Yeah. So let's start with just a basic definition of what is pediatric feeding disorder. And so pediatric feeding disorder is when a child really isn't eating appropriate for their age. So you drop them off at preschool and you need to give special instructions because they're not going to eat like their peers, or you need to bring specialty tools to help them eat, or anything like that. They are drinking all of their meals when they're 4 years old and should be able to be on table foods. So that is the biggest differentiator. And then you go a little bit further into the definition, and it's a complex issue. Feeding in general is complex, and our own typical feeding development is complex. It takes us 7 years to learn how to eat, and even longer to refine those skills, which is really surprising. A lot of people think it happens at 3 to 5, but it's definitely a learned skill, and there's a lot of different intricacies to it. And not only is it when a child's not eating appropriate for their age, but then there may be dysfunction in any one of 4 domains. And that's the definition of the disorder. So in the medical domain, if there is dysfunction in that domain and that becomes a challenge, or even if there is an unidentified like medical condition, like a common one that gets unidentified is this condition called eosinophilic esophagitis, which is your esophagus is inflamed, and that makes it really challenging to eat. So that may be showing up as poor behaviors at mealtime because the child's in pain when they're eating. So that's the medical domain. And then there's the feeding skill domain. So do you have all of the skills to be able to chew and move your tongue and swallow and be able to do all of the things that you need to eat? And together are the 2 domains that kind of kick off the PFD definition, and then the other 2 become almost consequences of the other 2. And that is there something nutritionally going on? If we're only eating chicken nuggets, what's happening to our nutritional makeup and what ramifications does that have? And then on the psychosocial side. And so this disorder is different than a lot of conditions because feeding is so interrelated to our relationship with our parent and caregiver. And so not only is it the child and how the child is showing up, or the behaviors that are happening at mealtimes that are trying to communicate something's wrong, but also the stress and the anxiety for the whole family during mealtimes. It is truly a condition that brings families to their knees. And because it's a condition that's only been around officially for 3 years, it's something that's not very common, like known by healthcare professionals. And so families end up really feeling alone in this and don't have the support that they need to be able to identify it, treat it, and find the right resources and support.
Yeah, wow. I was thinking in all the parenting books, it was you make them eat these foods or you're not the best parent. Like you're not putting in enough effort. And what you're saying, they might not even have the skills physically to be able to even process some of the foods that we're even offering. So that's, yeah.
That's so true. And I know you asked about myths, and I think that is one of the biggest, is that I think we're all very comfortable in knowing the food pyramid or my plate and like all of those considerations of the makeup of a healthy diet. But I think what's not as commonly known or discussed, the status of general awareness, is what happens when that is not easily done. It's not just trying to get your children to eat their vegetables. It's a very real medical condition that can impact the psychosocial makeup of a child too. And especially as the child gets older, there's another condition as an older child and even into adulthood that's called ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And PFD can turn into that if it goes undiagnosed or if the severity is really complex. The psychosocial domain becomes the primary driver.
And that's where you think about kids in kindergarten or first grade, where they're not as good at advocating for themselves and getting the help they need. And then they're eating different things than their peers, or they're not touching.
That's where a lot of it shows up at school too, is I think in the peer-to-peer comparison is really challenging because it's challenging on families. It's challenging in any parenting aspect, I feel like. But yeah, it is. And there's so much conversation around healthy meal times and all of this. And so I know a lot of our families that struggle with PFD and ARFID, they will send their children to school with the foods that they can and will eat. And sometimes that's not your like my plate healthiest lunchbox, but they are just trying to practice being at a social setting and eating. And these are the foods that feel safe to that child. And that my hope as we build awareness for this is not only to help identify these kids earlier and get them the support that they need, but also for families that don't maybe have a child with PFD, or for school professionals, or for just the general public, as we have this acceptance and this understanding that you don't roll your eyes at the picky eater at the table, because they actually may be dealing with a lot more than you realize.
Yes. And we talked about this a tiny bit, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the difference between a picky eater and a child who actually has PFD.
Yes, we did. And that is like one of the most challenging pieces to identifying PFD, because there is in typical feeding development, there is a phase when your child is learning their own autonomy. They are learning more about themselves. They are learning the power of their own voice. They do get to control that. And that is where we start to see a very expected phase of picky eating. And so it's hard to say that your picky eater is definitely PFD, because every toddler is going to go through a variation of picky eating. And I think we're still at the status of PFD and ARFID research where we don't have great ways to distinguish between the two. We have better ways to distinguish between typical feeding and pediatric feeding disorder. But when the picky eating has gone on for a very long time, when foods continuously get narrowed down, or times are just a huge stressor and it's something you dread every single day, and the history of feeding has been challenging, maybe breastfeeding was a little bit challenging, maybe the transition to solids was a little bit challenging, but you got through it. Those are all indicators that what you're seeing is not picky eating, but maybe something a little bit more that we need to dive into.
And I don't think we've mentioned this. How old does this usually, what's the age span for PFD?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are definitely still research needs to be done, but we should be able to pick it up, but definitely under 3. But a lot of times you'll see that families under the age of 1 are trying to say that something's going on, and then they figure it out. And then it's a little bit of, oh, we're figuring it out. But then they get to 3 and they're like, oh, wait, this isn't picky eating. And that's a product of healthcare professionals and physicians not always knowing that it's pediatric feeding disorder and not picky eating, because I think oftentimes they are expecting a child to grow out of it. And so there can be, it's well-meaning, but often detrimental, this wait and see approach. And that is a challenge, because if there really is an issue that we need to get ahead of, if there's an undiagnosed medical condition, if there's some skill problems that we need to work on, then we need to be focused on them as early as possible, because that whole time that we're developing our feeding skills and how we feel about meal times, that's critical time, because those neural pathways are being laid, and feeding is the foundation for all development. Be identified as an infant or even early child, but then it's also something that can exist throughout childhood and then persist into adulthood. Pediatric feeding disorder can oftentimes, for a lot of people, if they do still have some challenges, that's in adolescence is where it probably flips to ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder.
Wow. So it can affect their whole entire lives, both nutritionally and socially, if you think of
It's
it
so,
that way.
and that's the thing, is like, we don't realize how much feeding and eating plays a role in our social development as well as our physical development, because that's the birthday parties. A lot of our kids can't always go to birthday parties because they might start retching when they see the pizza and cake come out. So it's really impacts their life. We've talked to even adults, and it's just the saddest story of not really getting the support that you need early on, and that impacting their whole career. They have chosen to not be in a career where they needed to have food at meal or at meetings or be at lunch meetings or anything like that. And it's really impacts
Yeah.
people's lives.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because you keep mentioning the skills piece. I think we just take everything for granted. So I'm like, oh, they probably can chew. Is it all the way down to biting and chewing?
For
Just
sure.
those.
Those are the intricate skills. One of the other myths is that feeding is instinctual. And for us, as we develop, feeding is only instinctual for the first few days of life, where we're like learning the suck. But even then, we're still trying to coordinate suck, swallowing, and breathing at the same time, which is different than when we're in utero. And so as we start learning those skills, and then as we progressively get older, we start building up the jaw and the muscles and everything inside of our mouth to be able to do a lot of things. But there's more than 26 muscles and 6 cranial nerves that affect a single swallow. And so it's a really complex thing, because you're not only navigating kind of your physiology, how you're actually chewing food and moving it in your mouth and swallowing it, but the bite size, you're picking the bite size, you're trying to hold it in your mouth in the places that it needs to, you're trying not to choke. So there's a lot of intricacies as it relates to feeding skills, but it also goes into, as you get older, you need to know how to pick things up off the plate. So it's not just once food is in your mouth, but it's, am I bringing it to my mouth? And what are the senses that I'm experiencing? And how is my sensory concept of a mealtime, both how I am showing up in my own regulation, and also what am I being exposed to at mealtime as it relates to all of the senses involved.
So really, if you had a child with PFD, are they choking a lot on their food? Is that kind of the...
That is one of the ways that it would manifest, and that would point to a few different scenarios. One of the things that we point to early in life as a red flag is if you are trying to feed an infant and they are having a lot of reflux, or you see them choking and gagging, it could be indicative of a few different problems, primarily like aspiration or some other kind of like skill base. We really need to be working with someone who has expertise in swallowing and swallowing disorders. So yeah, and you see that. And then the challenge is, if that's not well identified or taken care of, a child may get used to gagging at the sight of food, because that's what's been built up and that's been the conditioned behavior. And so you still see adults who maybe are gagging at food, and it's just because they had this buildup as they grew up.
Wow. So then it becomes a response instead of an experience then.
Yeah.
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 Wow. This is so complex. I didn't realize that there were so many facets to it.
It is so complex. And I think that's what makes it almost really challenging to share about from an awareness perspective. Is in general, I think we're not aware of how complex just typical feeding development is. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and we at daycare and at our well child visits, we're always filling out the forms about where their development's at or answering questions about where their development's at. But there's not a lot of like, where is your feeding development at questions. The conversation is breast or bottle, weight, height, like how's feeding going? That's the status of the questions. And then at daycare, when you're filling out things like the ages and stages questionnaire, you're learning about, are they talking? Are they walking? Are they doing all of these things? But you're not learning, are they at the level where they can tolerate food? Are they picking up spoons? Like what is their feeding development? And one of the things that we would like to see in the future is for any of those series of things where we're checking on a child's development, we need to be considering feeding as its own developmental domain because it is so complex and it's just not well known as a complex domain in child development.
Yeah. So when people come to you, I'm assuming they're at their wits' end because they've either child is choking on everything or they're just not eating food in the way that they're expecting they should. How do you help them navigate what to do next? And what does that look like?
Yeah, you are right that families often are finding us when they are out of ideas of what to do next. When a family finds us, we are available on social media, on our website, over email, and it can look many different ways, but oftentimes it starts with kind of an intake form or an intake call where we just try to get an understanding of what's going on and where you're at in your journey because everybody's different and every child with PFD and ARFID is different. And so we try to get an understanding of kind of what you've done up until this point. Have you done tests? How supportive is your pediatrician? Have you seen different providers? Because all of that matters in terms of what your next step looks like. We have a family support roadmap, which really guides this conversation for you. So it starts with, okay, are you worried there's a problem? Here's some questions that you need to ask yourself that are red flags for maybe a feeding challenge that we need to be looking at. And then we talk with you and figure out what kind of the next steps are. And then we have a provider directory that has providers across the country and some international providers. We have a family guide, which walks you through Pediatric Feeding Disorder 101. I'm new to this condition. What tests are happening? How do I need to take care of myself throughout this? The put your own mask on first analogy. And then some other webinars and information. And we just exist as that support. It can be a very lonely journey for families who are looking to support their children. And oftentimes these families have heard from well-meaning families and even physicians like they'll grow out of it or give them to me for a weekend, I'll get them to eat, or understanding that exists around how complicated this issue is. When you are trying to identify a PFD and get the right treatment, that really does take a physician who is listening to you and who is on your side. Some of our tools help with articulating what might be happening at meal times and to be able to have a productive conversation with your physician, because I don't know if you relate to this, but even any issue that I go into the doctor's office with my children, I like deer in headlights sometimes. I'm like, I wanted to talk about this. I like it's gone out the door.
Like a tick list of other stuff that pops up in front of it. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Or they say something and takes you down a rabbit hole. So what the tools do with that Feeding Matters has for families is it allows you to be able to point to it and say, here's what we're seeing. This is pediatric feeding disorder. Do you think this might be happening? And then we go into really identifying if there's anything medical going on and checking status on skill development and then working on it. But we do really advise to our families that we need to be looking at like the medical components first before diving into any feeding skill or psychosocial and nutrition therapy type things.
I love that you have those resources for parents too, because I think articulating it is really tricky. And as a young parent, especially, I was always worried that I was like that hypervigilant parent that came in with, okay, they sat up and they looked sideways funny and they're like, okay, that's going to happen a lot more. So I think having an actual tool to take in and say, here's what I see is pretty huge.
So true. I'm really glad that we do have those resources for families because I do think it helps that conversation. it allows a family member, parent, caregiver, whoever's in that room, say, this is what I'm seeing in, like, here's the paper that says this. Here are the flags that came up in taking this questionnaire. Here's the information about PFD. And that's a better conversation to have with a physician than I'm nervous they're feeding. With the right physician, they're going to listen to you. But you do worry sometimes that you come across as a hypervigilant mom and get dismissed easily because you're a hypervigilant mom.
Yeah. And if they've seen you enough, that might accidentally happen, right? But if you have
Yeah.
a path that you can prove that you've already looked at, that's a lot different story, a different ending. Yeah. Yeah. Your Feeding Matters website, I was really impressed with, I have to say. So I feel like if somebody was like really struggling and nervous about reaching out to a person, it's a great spot for them to get started and just familiarize themselves with the tools you have available. But I think your passion and your knowledge, something that's so new, is I would be calling you. So personally,
Oh, thank
yeah.
you. It's that website is there for families to find us when they need us. Families are doing extraordinary things to make sure their infants and children are well cared for. And that kind of is across the board. But when we zero in on feeding, that often means sometimes feeding throughout the night to make sure they're gaining weight. And we want to be that kind of bright star in maybe a dark time, to know that you're not alone in this, that we're here with you. Here's some resources, here's some support, and we'll walk this path with you, because it's a long path. If there's any disruption along that 7 years of feeding development, it's going to take a lot longer. And so it's not just a switch that we can flip. It's not just a medication that we can provide. Often there is not a great like silver bullet, but it takes time to build.
And on that site, I think, were there resources to connect with the other parents?
Yeah, that's huge too, because I think that's what, you know, means the world to families, is to hear from someone who's been there before, when they're used to hearing from people who maybe don't understand it at the level that they're experiencing it. And so part of that intake is, do you want to connect with a parent who has been there before? This is a program called our Parent to Parent Power of Two mentoring program. And so a parent may be struggling with many different things, but they're able to talk to another parent who has been there if they are interested in that. And it can just be one conversation if they need that. It can be more of a long-term match. We really try to individualize it to what the family needs.
We were half joking at the beginning before we even started recording about how sometimes parents can put so much pressure on themselves to be perfect. And I think that brings it to a level where you're like, oh, actually, this is okay, because this isn't that different from what they're experiencing. It gives you some validity to what you're experiencing and feeling.
Especially if you are doing that kind of comparison piece of parenting, which is, I'm seeing all these kids on social media with messy faces at their meal times, and that's just not what I'm experiencing at home. Or I talk to my friends and that's what and my parents are telling me this about how I ate as a child. And it's just an influx of information. And we're already really trying to navigate the shame and the guilt that comes with just parenting, and feeding to be the one thing think and want and dream of the most when we're having an infant. If that goes wrong, it can feel incredibly lonely and it becomes a real challenge. And so I agree with you that being able to talk to someone else and realize there are others that are going through this. This is what their experience looked like. It's definitely not my fault that we're here, that this is just something that happens, and actually happens more than we realize. I didn't share the prevalence stats, but pediatric feeding disorder is more prevalent than autism and cerebral palsy. It's more than 1 in 37 children under the age of 5 has PFD. And for a child with a chronic health condition, it's more than 3 in 5 children. And so it is a very prevalent condition that just doesn't get the awareness that it deserves, which then leaves a family feeling like it's just them.
Wow, that's a huge number. That's a much higher than I imagined.
It's pretty significant. So it's definitely a crisis that we need to get in front of.
Interesting. Interesting. If people are listening and they're starting to tune into, maybe this is something I need to check out, maybe I need to act on something, what are a couple things that they could do after they listen to us today to just get things going?
Sure. So I think number one, if any of this is resonating, and you have had a challenging time feeding your infant or toddler or even child, number one, no, it's not your fault. This is a really complex problem. There is not a lot of awareness. Even healthcare providers and physicians don't know a lot about this, and they get very limited nutrition education in school. And so, number one, let's get you some support. And so, let's figure out what might be going on. In feedingmatters.org, there's a orange button that says get help, and that takes you to our family support page, which asks 6 questions about mealtimes and things like, how long do mealtimes take? Does your child let you know when they're hungry? Are you worried about your child's feeding? This quick questionnaire allows you to really identify and potentially determine if you need to be looking further into feeding. And then you can use that questionnaire when you are going to your physician. And so I would say definitely using our support resources to help you do that. But let's make sure that we are talking to a physician, figuring out if we need to do some other tests or some therapies and some other intervention. But hopefully you've connected with a parent through Feeding Matters and can feel empowered to advocate for yourself and your child, and then can leverage our resources to be a part of that conversation. And maybe if it's not something where you want to take action yet, or you're not ready to take action, maybe just following Feeding Matters on Instagram, just to be aware of the resources and use them when you feel ready, because sometimes it can be hard to know, is this picky eating or is it PFD? And so if you feel like you're not ready to jump into action yet, that's okay too. And just knowing that this is an issue that can be worked on, but we can work on it together, and we're here for you whenever you're ready, if you need to.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Jaclyn, tell us again the website, exact name, and if you're available to be contacted, where they can contact you.
Yes, for sure. So our website is feedingmatters.org. The easiest email to reach out to us, especially if you're a parent that needs support, is info@feedingmatters.org. And then on social media, we're at Feeding Matters is our handle.
This has been amazing. Like I said, I think it's something that a lot of parents wonder about, but now you've given it a name and you can given it a roadmap. And so I feel like this is just such a valuable episode. So thank you so much for being here and giving us so many valuable nuggets.
Oh, thank you, Dory. And it's just so important for people like yourself that have a platform to be able to share about this and support families in this way. And so I just am really grateful that you are shining light on this issue. So thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here.
Yeah.